This is a portrait by Anthony Van Dyke. Um, it's called Charles the First Dismounted. It was done in 1635. Van Dyke is very skillful at creating portraiture that flatters the subject. He creates full-length portraits that have glimpses into the lofty aristocracy. They hold a sense of untold power and wealth. Like when you look at this portrait, you can't tell exactly how this man became wealthy, but you can tell that he is. Part of that is the iconography that you see in front of you. He wears an outfit that's made of very fine fabrics. He has an person behind him who is hired hands tending to the horse. And he's standing there with his arm on his hip and his staff in the other hand, looking relaxed, but having a sense of smugness, a sense of haughtiness on his face. This display of power in portraiture is something that you see that speaks of the wealth of the person, of the individual that you're looking at. He stands on his estate and sort of looks like the king of his castle in that space. This particular portrait is of Charles the First, but you see that also he includes a monkey, a dwarf, and a horse, a hunting horse. You notice in every case, like no matter where you stand within the portrait, that Charles looks down at you, the viewer. There's a sense of superiority that these portraits take on as they look at the viewer. Charles I ruled England, and he loved the English terrain. He looks calm and leisurely, but this portrait really drips with a sense of power and glory. Van Dyke invents the language that's used repeatedly in the history of art in terms of portraiture. Van Dyke does these portrait series, and then in the 18th century we see portraits that are totally indebted to Van Dyke's exploration of how to create a sense of haughtiness in the portraiture. John Singer Sargent was one that was highly influenced by Van Dyke. And 20th century fashion photography is totally indebted to Anthony Van Dyke's style. There's sort of a different elevated plane that the sitter stands on. And Van Dyke knows how to separate his subject on a sense of haughtiness that is a completely different level than what the viewer is at. So, my specialty is in African art, and my specialty is actually in the art of the African diaspora, meaning contemporary African art. And one of the artists that I absolutely love is Kinde Wiley. He is the man that painted the portrait of President Obama, his exit portrait to the White House. And I can't ever go over Anthony Van Dyke without showing you Kinde Wiley's work, because I think he uses Anthony Van Dyke's portrait style and the haughtiness that he shows his subject as having, And Kinde Wiley uses this and adopts this type of portraiture to elevate people in society who hadn't traditionally been in that elevated role. It's a contemporary way in which we use Anthony VanDyke's work. And it's a new voice that we see that contemporary artists are able to throw back to an art historical era, and have the person that is in the portrait automatically assume all of the things that came along with Anthony VanDyke's portraiture. A sense of haughtiness, a sense of the subject being on a completely different level than the viewer. And even though Kinde Wiley uses subjects that weren't actually in the space of being in the divine right to rule, the subject becomes or sort of inherits the portraiture that Anthony VanDyke does by having the subject stand in the same stance and look down in the same way that Anthony VanDyke's portraiture looks downward. Kinde Wiley has been featured on many TV shows. If you like the show Empire, a lot of Kinde Wiley's work is in it. And he really is quite a fascinating artist in terms of taking someone or something that we hadn't seen in a certain way and changing up how we see it in contemporary society. He allows for a sense of, or a new voice in the subject. At any rate, Kinde Wiley is a contemporary artist that uses Anthony VanDyke's work to create a sense of his own voice and a sense of his own take on historical art.